In early 2024, something very unusual happened in the United States Congress, and most Americans never noticed it. Two Democratic members of the U.S. House of Representatives passed away just days apart. Raul Grijalva from Arizona and Sylvester Turner from Texas. Each of these members represented around 750,000 to 800,000 people. Combined, that means nearly 1.6 million Americans suddenly lost their representation in Congress. In a functioning democracy, the process for replacing a member of Congress is normally straightforward. A special election is announced, a vote is held, and a vacant seat is filled so that the people of that district continue to have a voice in Washington. But in these two cases, the process took far longer than expected, and the delays left citizens without representation for months, and in one case, close to a full year. Let's start with Arizona. After Raul Grijalva passed away, a special election was held. His daughter, Adelita Grijalva, ran for the seat and won the election. Under normal circumstances, the winner of a special election is sworn into Congress soon after the results are certified. Once sworn in, they can begin representing their district, voting on legislation, and providing essential services to constituents. However, even after winning, Adelita Grijalva was not sworn in. The Speaker of the House at the time, Republican Mike Johnson, chose not to administer the oath of office. Without being sworn in, she could not officially begin her duties. This left the people of her district with no member of Congress, no one to vote on their behalf, and no access to congressional services such as help with Social Security, veterans benefits, IRS issues, or any of the federal support systems that elected representatives help manage. Her case was unusual because there was no legal barrier preventing her from being sworn in. It was simply not scheduled. The delay appeared to be a strategic political decision at a time when the Republican majority in the House was extremely narrow, and adding even one Democratic vote would shift the balance. Now let's look at Texas, where the situation was even more drawn out. When Congressman Sylvester Turner passed away, Texas Governor Greg Abbott had the authority and responsibility to schedule a special election. There was already a statewide election set for May, and Abbott could have easily added this congressional race to the existing ballot. Doing so would have ensured a quick and cost-effective process, allowing voters to elect a new representative promptly. But Governor Abbott did not add the election to May ballot. Instead, he waited. Months passed before he finally announced the date for the special election. And when the election was held, the results required runoff under Texas law because no candidate won more than 50% of the vote. The top two vote-getters, both Democrats, advanced to a runoff that would not take place until the following January. That meant Texans in that district would go nearly 10 to 12 months without any representation in Congress. During that time, they had no one to speak for them in legislative debates, no one to vote on important national issues, and no office to help them with federal services. In short, they were politically invisible. For millions of Americans, a representative is not just a politician. They are a point of access to the federal government. Without a representative, people lose more than a vote in Congress. They lose support. They lose advocacy. They lose someone who can elevate their community's needs at the national level. Why did these delays happen? The answer appears to be political calculation. With a narrow Republican majority in the House, keeping two Democratic seats empty, even temporarily, meant fewer opposing votes. In a chamber where major legislation can be decided by just one or two votes, the absence of two Democratic members benefits the majority party. This situation raises serious concerns about the health of American democracy. Elections are supposed to give the people a voice. Special elections exist so that when a seat becomes vacant, representation can be restored quickly. But in these cases, procedural delays were used in a way that undermined the purpose of representation itself. When the government fails to fill vacancies efficiently, it is the citizens who pay the price. These delays not only weaken trust in the system, but also create a dangerous precedent that political leaders can intentionally postpone representation for strategic advantage. The story of these two vacant seats is not dramatic because of scandal or corruption. It is concerning because of how quietly it happened, how normal it was treated, and how little attention it received. Many Americans were unaware that over 1 million people spent months without a voice in Congress. Segment 1 shows the beginning of a growing pattern. Elected officials delaying representation for political benefit, instead of prioritizing the rights of the people. After the special election in Arizona was won by Adelita Grijalva, the next step should have been routine. She would travel to Washington, D.C., take the oath of office on the House floor, and officially begin serving as a member of Congress. This step is usually immediate because the purpose of a special election is to restore representation as quickly as possible. The voters had spoken, the results were confirmed, and she was ready to serve. But despite winning the election, Adelita Grijalva was kept waiting. She was not sworn in, and without being sworn in, she had no legal authority to act on behalf of her district. She could not vote in Congress, could not join committee meetings, could not hire a staff, and could not provide essential services to constituents. The person responsible for the swearing-in process was then Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, a Republican. The Speaker controls the House schedule and determines when swearing-in ceremonies occur. In this case, Johnson chose not to bring the House into session for the purpose of swearing her in. On paper, this delay appeared procedural. In reality, it carried major political advantage. To understand the strategy, it is important to look at the context in the House of Representatives at the time. The Republican majority was extremely slim, just a handful of seats. Every vote mattered. Losing even one vote could change the outcome of a bill or a legislative negotiation. Adding a Democrat to the House would shift the numbers and make governing more difficult for the Republican majority. By delaying Adelita Grijalva's swearing in, the Republican leadership effectively kept one Democratic vote out of the chamber. This meant the majority margin stayed slightly more favorable to Republicans. In other words, the district remained unrepresented not by accident or due to paperwork delays, but because of a calculated political choice. It is important to note that there was no constitutional, legal, or procedural rule preventing her from being sworn in. There was no dispute about the election results. The only barrier was that Mike Johnson and Republican leadership did not schedule the ceremony. This situation was concerning for several reasons. First, it demonstrated how easily the rights of voters can be held hostage for political gain. The people of that district fulfilled their role as citizens. They voted. They chose a representative, and they expected that representative to take office. But their choice was blocked, not by the law, but by political strategy. Second, it highlighted a loophole in the U.S. system. A speaker can effectively freeze representation simply by refusing to hold a swearing-in session. Even if the election is completed, even if the representative is ready to serve, the process can still be stalled. This raises a larger question about whether a single political leader should have that much control over the timing of representation. Third, the delay had direct consequences for the people of the district. Without an active member of Congress, citizens could not access essential constituent services. Many people do not realize that a large part of a representative's job is not just voting on laws. Members of Congress handle thousands of requests every year from individuals who need help navigating federal agencies. This includes assistance with Social Security, passports, immigration paperwork, IRS issues, Medicare, and veterans benefits. When a seat is vacant, these services are stalled, sometimes completely unavailable. Adelita Grijalva's office could not open new cases, could not access federal systems, and could not act for the people. Staff cannot be hired until a member is sworn in. Federal casework cannot be processed. Constituents are left on their own. For months, this Arizona district was essentially shut out of federal support. Another element that made this blockade stand out was a lack of transparency. There was no official explanation given for the delay. There was no public statement to the voters about why their representative was not being sworn in. Without media attention or public pressure, the issue remained mostly hidden from national conversation. Critics of the blockade argued that this move was not just a political tactic, but a direct undermining of democratic rights. If elected representatives can be prevented from taking office after a fair election, then the power of the voters becomes weaker. Democracy depends on transitions of power happening smoothly and immediately. Deliberate delays erode trust in the system and show that political control can outweigh the will of the people. Supporters of the delay, although fewer and less vocal, claimed that the Speaker had the authority to schedule the House as he saw fit. They framed the situation as a procedural decision rather than a political one. But even this defense raised questions about whether procedural power should be used to benefit one party's control rather than protect democratic representation. This event was not widely covered in mainstream media. It received limited national attention, meaning many Americans never learned that an elected representative was kept from taking office for political reasons. The silence surrounding the issue helped it go unnoticed, even though it affected hundreds of thousands of people. In summary, the swearing-in blockade of Adelita Grijalva showed how political leaders can use timing and procedural control to influence representation. It demonstrated that even after voters choose their representative, those in power can delay or restrict that representative from serving. This situation revealed a vulnerability in the democratic process, one that could be exploited to gain political advantage at the expense of citizens' rights. While the situation in Arizona with Adelita Grijalva highlighted the use of House procedural control to delay representation, the case in Texas shows another method, this time to the state's executive power. When Congressman Sylvester Turner of Texas passed away, the responsibility to schedule a special election fell to the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott. In theory, this process should have been straightforward. Turner's seat needed to be filled quickly to restore representation to the nearly 800,000 residents of his district. The law in Texas allows the governor to set the date for a special election when a congressional seat becomes vacant. Importantly, there was already a general election scheduled for May 2024. Governor Abbott had the option to simply add the special election to that existing ballot. Doing so would have saved time, ensured voter participation, and allowed the district to regain representation quickly. Instead, Abbott chose to do nothing for months. No announcement was made. No public communication explained the delay. Constituents were left without a timeline, unable to plan for the election, and without their representative in Congress. During this period, the district's residents were effectively silent in national politics. Finally, Abbott scheduled the election for later in the year. However, under Texas election rules, if no candidate receives more than 50% of the vote in a special election, a runoff must occur between the top two candidates. This procedural rule meant that even after the initial election was held, the process could not conclude immediately. In this case, the top two candidates were both Democrats, which meant that the seat could not be filled until runoff was completed, pushing the final representation into the following January. This strategy had a direct effect. Turner's district would remain without representation for nearly a full year. Unlike Arizona, where the winner was blocked from taking office due to congressional procedural control, in Texas the delay was implemented to the timing of the election itself. Governor Abbott had complete discretion over the schedule, yet he chose a timeline that maximized the period in which the seat remained empty. This appears to be a deliberate political calculation aimed at limiting the number of Democratic votes in Congress. The consequences of this delay are significant. Constituents rely on their member of Congress for many essential services. These include navigating federal agencies, securing veterans' benefits, helping with Social Security or Medicare issues, and advocating on local matters at the national level. Without an official representative, none of these services could be effectively addressed. Federal offices that work with congressional staff had to operate without local oversight. Residents lost direct access to someone who could speak for them in Washington, and community issues could not be raised at the federal level. Moreover, this delay undermines the very principle of democratic accountability. Elections exist to ensure that citizens' voices are heard promptly. When a government official, whether a state governor or congressional leader, can slow down this process, it effectively silences voters. Citizens are left waiting, unable to influence national policy, and forced to watch as political calculations take precedence over their rights. Legal challenges were discussed in response to Abbott's inaction. Local officials and advocates considered filing lawsuits to force the governor to set a date for the election sooner. The discussion alone highlights how extraordinary the situation had become. In a normal democracy, there would be no question or legal dispute about holding a special election after a vacancy. The fact that legal intervention had to be considered underscores the unusual and concerning nature of the delay. Critics argue that Abbott's actions demonstrate a strategic effort to reduce Democratic influence in a narrowly divided House. The delay ensured that for months, the district had no vote in Congress, while national legislation and votes continued. This tactic, while legal under Texas election rules, raises ethical questions about whether elected officials should prioritize partisan advantage over the basic right of citizens to representation. Beyond politics, the human impact of these delays cannot be overstated. Residents of the district had to manage issues on their own, without assistance from a congressional office. People waiting for federal aid or guidance faced delays. Community organizations lacked an advocate at the national level. The absence of a representative created a real, measurable gap in services that directly affected the lives of constituents. In the end, Texas provides a clear example of how the timing of elections can be used as a tool for political advantage. While no laws were broken, the decision to slow-walk the election demonstrates the ways that procedural discretion can be exploited. It also highlights a broader issue in American democracy. When mechanisms meant to empower citizens can be delayed or manipulated, the people lose their voice, even in a system designed to represent them. Governor Abbott's actions, combined with the House leadership's blockade in Arizona, reveal a pattern of strategic delays that leave citizens without representation for months. Both cases show that while elections and procedural rules exist to maintain democracy, political leaders can, and sometimes do, use those same rules to limit participation and influence outcomes in their favor. By the time these political delays reach their peak, the human impact of leaving congressional districts without representation became undeniable. When Raul Grijalva's and Sylvester Turner's districts lost their elected officials, it wasn't just a procedural problem. It was a problem for real people, families, seniors, veterans, and everyday citizens who rely on their representatives to help navigate federal systems. A member of Congress is responsible for more than voting on bills in Washington. One of their most important functions is constituent services. This includes helping people access Social Security benefits, Medicare, Medicaid, or veterans benefits. Representatives assist constituents with navigating the IRS, immigration issues, and other federal agencies. Without a member of Congress, these services are slowed or halted entirely. Staff cannot act independently. They require an active, sworn-in representative to process requests and intervene when necessary. For months, constituents in these districts experience these delays firsthand. Take, for example, a veteran living in Turner's Texas district. This person might need help accessing benefits from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Normally, the congressional office will provide guidance, submit inquiries, and escalate unresolved issues. Without a representative, the veteran has no advocate in Washington, and their requests can get stuck in bureaucratic limbo. For people who depend on timely assistance for health care or financial support, these delays are not minor inconveniences. They are life-altering obstacles. Similarly, families and seniors awaiting assistance with Social Security, Medicare, or emergency programs like SNAP were affected. Federal systems are already complex, and representatives' offices exist to provide a bridge between citizens and the agencies. Without that bridge, Americans are forced to navigate confusing procedures alone, often with limited access to guidance. In some cases, delays can lead to missed payments, postponed benefits, or even financial hardship. The lack of representation also impacts community advocacy and funding. Members of Congress advocate for their districts and national programs, including infrastructure funding, disaster relief, school resources, and economic development projects. When a seat is vacant, local communities lose their voice in these decisions. Projects that require congressional approval or coordination may be delayed or canceled entirely. Schools, hospitals, and local organizations can suffer as a result. Moreover, the delay in representation affects accountability. Constituents expect their elected officials to respond to questions, hold town halls, and provide updates on national issues that impact their lives. Without a representative, citizens have no official channel to express concerns, ask questions, or hold anyone accountable for decisions in Congress. This erodes trust in the government and leaves people feeling disconnected from the political system that is supposed to serve them. This situation is not abstract. It affects tens of thousands of people in each district. In Arizona, Adelita Grijalva's office could not officially begin work after the election, so constituents had no staff to process requests. In Texas, the months-long delay of the special election meant constituents had no access to a congressional office at all. For these Americans, the absence of representation translated into real-world hardships. The delays also have a psychological and civic impact. People expect that participating in elections ensures their voices will be heard. When political leaders deliberately delay representation, it sends a signal that elections and votes can be undermined, leaving citizens disillusioned. Young voters, in particular, may lose faith in the system when they see elected officials prevented from serving simply for strategic advantage. This can reduce civic participation, weaken democracy, and increase distrust in government institutions. It is important to recognize that these delays were not caused by external crises, natural disasters, or legal complications. They were deliberate decisions made by those in power, by a congressional leader refusing to swear in a winning candidate in Arizona, and by a governor choosing when to schedule an election in Texas. These decisions were made in the name of political strategy, not public service, and their consequences fell squarely on the people who should have been represented. Ultimately, the cost of silence is measured in both tangible and intangible ways. Tangible costs include delayed benefits, stalled projects, and unaddressed community needs. Intangible costs include diminished trust in government, weakened civic engagement, and the feeling of powerlessness among citizens. These costs are not hypothetical. They are experienced by thousands of Americans every day as a result of leaving districts without representation. Segment 4 makes it clear that democracy is not just a system of laws and elections. It is a living system that depends on active participation and timely representation. When elected officials are prevented from taking office, or when elections are delayed, the very purpose of democracy is undermined. Citizens are left without advocates, without access, and without a voice in the decisions that affect their lives. For a democracy that claims to value representation and accountability, this is a failure, a preventable and deliberate failure that must be recognized and addressed. The stories of Arizona and Texas are not isolated incidents. They are part of a larger pattern, a pattern that shows how democratic processes can be slowed, manipulated, or even blocked by those in power. What happened in these two districts should alarm every American, regardless of political affiliation, because it reveals how fragile representation can be when procedural rules are used for strategic advantage. In Arizona, Adelita Grijalva won a special election fairly and legally, yet she was not sworn in. In Texas, Governor Greg Abbott delayed the special election, and the resulting runoff extended the vacancy for nearly a full year. In both cases, hundreds of thousands of Americans were left without a voice in Congress. The consequences of this are clear. No voting power, no advocacy, and no access to services that constituents rely on. Without representation, people are disconnected from their government. Requests for help with Social Security, Medicare, veterans benefits, and other federal programs are delayed or blocked. Local organizations and community projects that depend on federal advocacy are left without guidance. Families who rely on federal assistance face obstacles that can affect their health, finances, and daily lives. This is the human cost of leaving districts unrepresented. But the impact goes beyond services. Democracy is built on the principle that citizens have a voice and that their votes matter. When elected officials are prevented from taking office or when elections are delayed, that principle is weakened. Citizens who voted have their voices muted, and the message is clear. Even when you participate, your representation can be delayed or denied for political reasons. This erodes trust in the system and undermines the legitimacy of government institutions. The political motives behind these delays are also evident. In Arizona, the swearing-in blockade was tied to maintaining a narrow House majority. In Texas, the slow scheduling of elections effectively reduced Democratic votes in a critical district. Both situations show that political advantage can take priority over the rights and needs of ordinary citizens. When the system allows this to happen, democracy itself is at risk. The larger lesson is urgent. Procedural rules and authority, whether held by a congressional leader or a state governor, are not neutral when they are used to limit representation. They can be exploited to silence millions of people, and the effects are measurable. Millions of Americans were left without a voice in national decisions for months, affecting everything from health care to disaster relief, funding for local schools, and access to federal programs. This is not a partisan argument. It is a structural one. Any political party at any time could exploit the same loopholes. The underlying issue is that democracy depends not only on elections, but on the smooth functioning of representative processes. When those processes are manipulated, citizens are the ones who pay the price. Furthermore, the lack of public attention to these delays is troubling. Most Americans did not know that nearly 2 million people were left without representation. The absence of widespread reporting allowed political leaders to act without accountability. This highlights the importance of transparency, citizen awareness, and vigilance in holding elected officials responsible for ensuring representation is continuous and fair. As the nation moves forward, these events must serve as a warning. Citizens need to recognize that democracy is fragile and that representation is more than just casting a ballot. It is an ongoing process that requires active enforcement, timely elections, and the accountability of those in power. Delays and blockades are not abstract. They affect real people in tangible ways, and they demonstrate that political calculations can outweigh public service if left unchecked. Ultimately, the vacant seats in Arizona and Texas represent more than procedural delays or political strategy. They represent a pause in democracy itself. Millions of Americans were left without a voice in the most fundamental institution of governance. Constituents suffered delays in essential services. Communities lacked advocacy, and the integrity of representation was compromised. This is a reminder that democracy is not automatic. It requires participation, vigilance, and accountability. Every citizen has a role in demanding that elected officials act responsibly, prioritize public service, and respect the will of the people. When seats remain empty or representatives are blocked from serving, the system fails, and the consequences are felt in homes, offices, and communities across the nation. Arizona and Texas are not just examples of delayed elections. They are examples of what happens when political power takes precedence over democratic principles. They serve as a wake-up call. The health of American democracy depends on citizens holding leaders accountable, on transparency in government, and on ensuring that every district has a voice at all times without obstruction. Democracy cannot be paused. Representation cannot be delayed. And as this story shows, the people must remain vigilant to ensure that their voices are never silenced again.